This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 413, part 2, entitled Men's E.R.A, that's Equal Rights Amendment. Carrying straight on, but this time reading from my MacBook Pro, since I forgot to, I left my Windows machine's power charger at my girlfriend's, so I'm using a different machine, but it's lower than the level of the camera, so I'll be looking down a lot, but I'll try to look up from time to time. Carrying straight on. The rest of this flyer discusses what form a male E.R.A could take. Off the top of my masculist head, there are several absolutely glaring pieces of masculist legislation that need to be brought in. The most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists is not against women, but against men, and that is the lack of the PARA, that's paternity rejection right. Women have the MARA, that is maternity rejection right, aka abortion right. That is, a woman has the legal right to reject an undesired pregnancy, but men don't, so that in practice millions of women lie to their boyfriends/husbands that they're taking the pill, whereas in reality they're trying to get pregnant, expecting consciously or more likely unconsciously that her boyfriend/husband will pay for the kid, since in her eyes men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies. This is what men are for in her monoconscious feminazi eyes. Thus, men are forced to pay for a kid that he does not want by law, thus manslaving him for decades. This is a major gender crime that screams out for reform. It profoundly abuses men, treating men as cash machines to be manipulated and be sexploited by profoundly parasitic females who think they can control men by offering them their cunts from time to time, thinking that men are merely manslavable objects to serve women to do what women want. So the first law that a male E.R.A would pass would be the PARA. The lack of the PARA is the greatest form of sexual discrimination that exists. The next major piece of legislation, that is male rights, to be put into the male E.R.A would be to reform the divorce courts by removing the fluffy feminist monopoly over them. Custody of kids after a divorce would need to be given jointly by default, crushing the attitude that millions of women have that her kids are hers. Well, they're not. Half of the kid's DNA is from the father. Half the kid's genes are his. The idea that millions of women have that the kids are hers is a blatant example of female chauvinism. Masculists aim to crush this fluffy feminist attitude by crushing the fluffy feminists themselves, spitting at them in public, by legislating against them so that men are prepared to be fathers again. If the gender laws in the divorce courts are not soon men-fared, then whole populations will be wiped out. The fluffy feminists are a major threat to the survival of whole cultures, so have to be removed, shot if necessary, for the sake of the preservation of the species. The political myopia of the fluffy feminists merely reflects negatively on the lack of political vision of women. And if women don't vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws, then men, masculist soldiers, will simply force them to by going out into the streets and shooting them. Millions of fluffy feminists in order to give men equal rights, a male E.R.A. There are many other forms of discrimination against men, or in the following case, boys. Primary school teachers are nearly 90% female in many countries, so that little boys get no male role models in a very formative portion of their lives. So the masculists want male primary school teachers to be given higher salaries as a form of positive discrimination against women, so that boys are not profoundly gender politically alienated as they are now by not being given male role models with whom they can identify and admire. Instead, they are dominated by alien giants called mothers and female teachers, while their fathers and male teachers are not part of their lives. So they grow up effeminized, not given male role models that they can identify with and emulate. Feminists are now routinely making movies and ads that are distinctly anti-male, reinforcing the ignorant monoconscious attitude that gender oppression is a one-way street, but in fact they are merely compounding the problem, since they are sexually discriminating themselves by pissing on men, the other half of the population. Masculists need to create legislation that blocks such misandrous feminazi propaganda that forces these monoconscious feminazi bitches to see that their monoconsciousness is deeply oppressive to men. Universities need to make masculist consciousness raising compulsory for women, the way male freshers today are forced to attend anti-rape classes. These masculist classes for women would need to teach them that they are not to be fluffies or pay a very heavy price. Women in high school need to be morally pressured by their male classmates to fip up or be rejected by men, both socially and sexually. Only then can society expect to see a flood of young women into the STEM fields, so that a much higher proportion of women become FIPs as adults, unlike the current very high proportion of young women, that is 80%, who choose to study fluffy crap majors, that is the soft option, the intellectually easy, intellectually lazy, memory-based option that does not require analytic thought as with math and the sciences. When many monoconscious feminists claim that women should have a choice to be careerists or to be stay-at-home mothers, they totally overlook the fact that if they are stay-at-home mothers, then who will pay for their food and the roof over their heads? Millions of monoconscious feminists make this mistake, unconsciously assuming some gullible, stupid manslave will be around who will marry her, work for her, be parasited upon by her, so that he pays for her to be a stay-at-home mom for the 2 decades or more it takes to see her kids move out of the house into adulthood. Masculists are killing off this man-slave role of the traditional man, telling men that marriage is toxic, so don't marry, don't have kids, be MGTOW, and put powerful moral pressure on women, and especially high school girls, to fip up, or they rot on the shelf. The male E.R.A. is not all that is needed by the masculists. Changing those gender political laws that discriminate against men is only part of the story. If the para, for example, is passed, that is legislated, then that will scare the shit out of millions of fluffy women, since it will force them to grow up, to become FIPs, to take responsibility for their own lives. Masculists want fundamental changes in the way that children are socialized and educated by teachers, so that young women are expected to pull their financial weight the way boys are. That is, that boys and girls are given the same gender role conditioning, more or less. Women have now a career window of half a century, so that now that women can work, they must work, and hence be socialized to be workers, no longer expecting fluffy style to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man. A decade from now, masculist ideas will probably have spread so thoroughly throughout the society that young women who are still fluffies at that time will suffer greatly. Society will spit at them. Their male classmates will label them fluffies, manslavers, parasites, scum, and they will be socially and sexually rejected. Future young fluffies will really suffer, so there will be very few of them, which is a major goal of the masculist movement, that is, to wipe out, that is, exterminate, slowly, fluffies, fluffy feminists, and to convert monoconscious feminists into bi-conscious feminists, that is, to educate feminists so that they are also female masculists, who vote together with men to mend fair the gender laws, who are very much aware that gender oppression is a two-way street, and who aim to remove both forms of sexual discrimination, that is, men against women and women against men. Women's rights committees in parliaments need to be converted into gender equality committees that look at both feminist and masculist issues, with half of the committee members being female and half male, so that both sets of issues, feminist and masculist, are treated equally. This is far from being the case today, since such committees are virtually all filled with monoconscious feminazi bigots who know nothing about masculism, who know nothing about how women oppress men, so are counterproductive, who create legislation that's favourable to women but disfavourable to men, who then merely generate a growing level of hatred against feminazis by men, for example in the fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts, by the growing number of misandrist movies and ads, etc. There's a limit to the level of patience of men towards these MFBs. If the feminazis keep up what they're currently doing, there will be a sex war against them, and they will eventually be shot. There are, of course, much more benign methods to solve the problems raised by the masculists, and one of them is the legislation of the male E.R.A, that is, to pass the E.R.A, but to interpret it as applying equally to both sexes, that is, to both what the feminists wanted in the 70s and failed to get, as shown in the Gloria Steinem movie, and to what the masculists want. Men certainly don't have an equal right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, a lack that causes millions of men to be forced into decades-long man-slavery to fluffy parasites. Men are not treated equally in the divorce courts, where the divorcing mothers get 90% custody of the kids. There are many examples of legal discrimination against men in most countries. No country on earth in 2021 has a legislated para, which shows how long a road the masculists have to travel before men are given equal rights with women. I wonder how long it will be before masculists, like myself and others, are standing before parliamentary and congressional committees, spelling out what we want regarding the equality of rights for men, and seeing the legislation of the para, the men fairing of the gender laws in the divorce courts, etc., etc. Will it be years? A decade or two? More? The feminists achieved a lot in the 70s and 80s, putting on the law books most of what the feminist leaders aimed for in the late 60s, when they got the second wave of feminism off the ground. Will the pioneering masculists of the 2020s, that is men's decade, the decade of men's lib, be able to achieve something comparable regarding the creation of equal rights for men, a male E.R.A? Time will tell. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 410 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.